Tonight, there is a paradox sitting at the center of Russia's power structure, one that grows louder the harder it is ignored. A state that projects inevitability abroad is quietly improvising at home. A leader who sells permanence is increasingly managing contingency, and the system that claims total control is spending more energy preventing collapse than pursuing victory. The Kremlin insists nothing is wrong. The question is why it now has to insist so loudly. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin's authority has rested on a carefully engineered arrangement. Not popular consent, not ideological devotion, but managed dependency. Regional governors owed their positions upward. Oligarchs traded political silence for commercial privilege. Security services gained influence in exchange for loyalty. Elections functioned as rituals of confirmation rather than contests of power. The genius of this system, if one can call it that, was its efficiency. It reduced uncertainty, it minimized visible conflict, it replaced persuasion with inevitability. But inevitability only works when outcomes are predictable. What we are seeing now inside Russia is not a sudden rebellion, not a dramatic palace coup, not tanks in the streets. Instead, it is something far more corrosive to authoritarian systems. Institutional hesitation, decision makers who wait, regional leaders who hedge, economic actors who quietly diversify their bets, security elites who follow orders precisely and only precisely without initiative. These are not acts of defiance. They are symptoms of doubt. Authoritarian governance depends on confidence cascading downward. When that confidence stalls at the top, the entire structure begins to behave differently. Orders are executed defensively. Policies are interpreted narrowly. Responsibility is avoided rather than claimed. The system still functions, but it loses momentum. And momentum is everything in a regime built on the illusion of constant forward motion. Consider the domestic political environment Putin now faces. Independent media has been dismantled. Opposition figures have been imprisoned, exiled, or silent. Civil society organizations have been labeled foreign agents and suffocated by regulation. On paper, this should produce stability. In practice, it has eliminated feedback. Without genuine signals from society, the Kremlin increasingly governs through assumption rather than information. That is not strength. That is strategic blindness. Economic pressure has intensified this dynamic. Sanctions have not caused immediate collapse, but they have forced structural adaptation. The Russian economy has been reoriented toward wartime production, resource extraction, and state-directed spending. This model can sustain activity, but it does so by cannibalizing future growth. Innovation declines, consumer welfare erodes, regional inequality deepens. These effects do not trigger revolt, but they quietly rearrange incentives. When opportunity narrows, loyalty becomes transactional, and transactions are renegotiated when circumstances change. Within the elite, the old balance has shifted. The technocrats who once promised modernization have been sidelined by security hardliners. The oligarch class has been disciplined into compliance, but also stripped of global mobility. Their assets are more vulnerable. Their leverage is reduced. Their silence is enforced, not chosen. Meanwhile, the security services, once the backbone of Putin's rise, now operate in an environment of mutual suspicion. Overlapping mandates, competing jurisdictions, and constant loyalty tests create friction. This is not cohesion. It is bureaucratic trench warfare. The war in Ukraine has accelerated all of this. Not because it is unpopular in the way Western observers often imagine, but because it has exposed the limits of centralized control. Mobilization disrupted families far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Casualty notifications reached regions previously untouched by geopolitical ambition. Local officials were forced to manage consequences they did not design. Each layer of the state absorbed costs that were never evenly distributed. The center issued decrees. The periphery absorbed reality. And then there was the moment brief, shocking, and impossible to unsee when armed forces moved against the state itself. The Wagner mutiny did not threaten immediate regime change. What it did threaten was the narrative of absolute command. For a few hours, the unthinkable occurred. The state hesitated. The response was improvised. Negotiation replaced force. Loyalty was assumed, then tested, then bargained for. That sequence matters. It revealed that power, when stretched, becomes negotiable. The Kremlin's response afterward was instructive. Reassert control. Reorganize security structures. Eliminate ambiguities. But also quietly redistribute authority. This is where speculation must be clearly labeled. Analysts suggest that the post-mutiny reshuffle indicates not confidence, but anxiety. When systems are secure, they do not need constant recalibration. When leaders feel unchallenged, they do not need to audit loyalty in real time. Public messaging has shifted as well. Victory is promised, but timelines are blurred. Sacrifice is glorified, but endpoints are undefined. External enemies are emphasized, but internal unity is framed as fragile. The tone is no longer triumphalist. It is managerial. And managerial language is the vocabulary of maintenance, not conquest. What emerges from all this is not a picture of imminent collapse. That would be a misunderstanding of how authoritarian systems fail. They rarely implode overnight. They erode, they stiffen, they lose adaptability. They become brittle. And brittleness is dangerous, not because it invites rebellion, but because it makes error irreversible. The first major reveal tonight is this. The greatest challenge Putin faces is not opposition, protest, or foreign pressure. It is the slow transformation of his own system from a tool of control into a machine that can no longer correct itself. When power becomes too centralized, failure becomes too personal. And when failure cannot be acknowledged, it multiplies. Which brings us to the next layer of this story, the international consequences of a regime that cannot admit limits and therefore keeps pushing beyond them. Authoritarian leaders often mistake endurance for effectiveness. Surviving pressure becomes confused with winning strategy. And nowhere is that confusion more dangerous than in foreign policy, where miscalculation carries costs that cannot be hidden from the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was not just a military operation. It was a test of assumptions. Assumptions about Western unity, assumptions about Ukrainian resistance, assumptions about economic resilience, assumptions about time. Each of those assumptions has been challenged, not catastrophically, but persistently. And persistence matters. From the Kremlin's perspective, the war was meant to resolve multiple problems at once. It would reassert regional dominance. It would deter NATO expansion. It would reinforce domestic legitimacy through nationalist mobilization. It would demonstrate that Russia could act decisively while democracies argued. That was the theory. The practice has been far messier. Militarily, Russia has adapted. It has learned. It has entrenched. But adaptation is not the same as advantage. The conflict has become a war of attrition. And attrition favors systems that can absorb loss without internal distortion. Democracies are often assumed to be weak in this regard. Yet what we have seen is something else entirely. Pluralistic societies arguing openly, adjusting policy, reallocating resources, and sustaining support through consent rather than coercion. Russia, by contrast, has had to manage information vertically. Losses are acknowledged selectively. Setbacks are reframed as strategy. Objectives are revised retroactively. This creates a lag between reality and decision-making. And in warfare, lag kills. Internationally, the consequences have been profound. NATO is larger, not smaller. European defense spending has increased, energy diversification has accelerated, countries that once hedged toward Moscow are recalibrating. None of this happened overnight. It happened through accumulation. Each decision, each response, each escalation layered on the last. The Kremlin's diplomatic posture has become increasingly transactional. Relationships are framed around leverage rather than alignment. Energy exports are weaponized. Grain deals are conditional. Security partnerships are opportunistic. This can generate short-term gains, but it erodes trust. And trust, once lost, is expensive to rebuild, especially for a state whose credibility depends on predictability. There is also the question of China. Publicly, the partnership appears solid. Joint statements emphasize shared opposition to Western dominance. Trade continues. Coordination persists. But partnerships between unequal powers are rarely symmetrical. As Russia becomes more isolated from Western markets, its dependency deepens. Dependency shifts bargaining power, and bargaining power shapes outcomes long after headlines fade. Speculation, clearly labeled. Some analysts argue that Moscow's growing reliance on non-Western partners constrains its strategic autonomy more than it admits. When alternatives narrow, choices shrink. When choices shrink, flexibility disappears. This is not subjugation, but it is not sovereignty either. Meanwhile, the global South watches closely. Not with moral alignment, but with pragmatic calculation. The lesson many draw is not about democracy versus authoritarianism in the abstract. It is about performance, about competence, about the cost of misjudgment. Russia's experience becomes a case study not in resistance to the West, but in the dangers of overestimating one's leverage. Back home, these international dynamics feed back into domestic pressure. Resources diverted abroad strain budgets at home. Sanctions complicate procurement. Military priorities crowd out social spending. Again, none of this produces immediate uprising. What it produces is competition between ministries, between regions, between narratives. The Kremlin's response has been to tighten ideological framing. The conflict is cast as existential. Compromise is equated with surrender. Critique is labeled disloyalty. This is a familiar authoritarian move. It rallies support, but it also raises stakes. When every policy becomes a matter of survival, failure becomes intolerable, and intolerable failure invites denial. The second major reveal is this: Russia's external assertiveness is now inseparable from its internal vulnerability. The more the regime invests in confrontation abroad, the less margin it has for error at home. Strategic overreach is not just about military fronts, it is about exhausting the very system meant to sustain them. History does not move in straight lines, but it does reveal patterns. One of the most consistent is this: authoritarian systems are excellent at seizing power and remarkably poor at managing complexity over time. They simplify. They centralize. They suppress variance. These traits produce speed. They also produce fragility. Russia today stands at a crossroads that is not marked by revolution, but by choice. The choice is whether to continue doubling down on a model that prioritizes control over competence, or to risk the uncertainty that comes with genuine reform. Thus far, the direction has been clear. Control has won every internal argument, and each victory has narrowed the range of future options. Democracies, by contrast, appear chaotic, precisely because they externalize conflict. Disagreement is visible. Policy debates are public. Leaders are criticized. Elections introduce uncertainty. From the outside, this looks like weakness. From the inside, it is how correction happens. Errors are exposed, alternatives are tested, authority is contested without being destroyed. This distinction matters because the global consequences of Russia's internal trajectory are not confined to its borders. A stagnant authoritarian state does not become passive. It becomes risk-prone. When legitimacy is no longer renewable through prosperity or consent, it must be maintained through narrative and force. That combination incentivizes confrontation, not cooperation. We can see this in information strategy. Russian state media no longer aims to persuade skeptics. It aims to exhaust them. Flooding, contradiction, and cynicism replace argument. The goal is not belief, but disengagement. If nothing is true, then nothing can be demanded. This approach can neutralize opposition temporarily. It also corrodes institutional credibility permanently. Inside the bureaucracy, younger officials face a different reality than their predecessors. Advancement is tied less to performance than to political reliability. Innovation carries risk. Initiative attracts scrutiny. Over time, talent migrates or disengages. The state becomes older, more cautious, more inward-looking. That is not a recipe for resilience. Speculation, explicitly labeled. Some observers suggest that the Kremlin is preparing for a prolonged period of managed decline rather than renewal. Policies prioritize stability over growth, predictability over progress, security over opportunity. If accurate, this represents a strategic admission that the system can endure but not evolve. Yet endurance is not victory. It is delay. The broader international system is changing. Demographic shifts, technological acceleration, climate pressure, and economic realignment are reshaping power. States that adapt will lead. States that resist will fall behind. Authoritarian rigidity struggles in such environments because it treats change as threat rather than reality. For democratic societies watching this unfold, there is a temptation to gloat, to predict collapse, to declare history finished. That would be a mistake. The lesson here is not inevitability. It is responsibility. Democracies must demonstrate that openness can deliver security, that pluralism can produce strength, that accountability can coexist with resolve. Russia's trajectory under Putin is not preordained, but it is increasingly constrained by choices already made. Each suppression narrows trust. Each escalation raises cost. Each denial postpones correction. Power remains concentrated, but concentration is not the same as control. It is dependence on a single figure, a single narrative, a single interpretation of reality. The final reveal tonight is this: the question is no longer whether Putin faces challenges inside Russia. he does. The question is whether a system designed to prevent challenge can survive a world that demands adaptation. History suggests that systems which refuse to learn eventually teach lessons the hard way. Every authoritarian system eventually confronts a problem it cannot publicly debate, cannot openly plan for, and cannot safely postpone forever: succession. Not transition, not reform, succession. The moment when power must move without unraveling the machinery built to contain it. In democratic systems, succession is institutionalized uncertainty. It is disruptive by design, stabilized by rules, and legitimized through consent. In authoritarian systems, succession is an existential threat disguised as a scheduling issue. It exposes rivalries, activates suppressed ambitions, and turns loyalty from a given into a variable. And once succession becomes an unspoken concern, it begins shaping decisions long before anyone admits it aloud. This is where Russia now finds itself. Vladimir Putin has constructed a state in which authority flows almost exclusively through him, not through ideology that can survive replacement, not through institutions strong enough to arbitrate conflict independently, not through a party capable of absorbing transition. Through him. That personalization of power was a strategic choice. It eliminated rivals, it simplified governance, it guaranteed control. It also ensured that the question of what comes next would be radioactive. Authoritarian leaders often attempt to defuse this problem through ambiguity. They avoid naming heirs. They extend terms. They rewrite rules. They cultivate the appearance of permanence. But ambiguity does not eliminate competition, it delays it, compressing it into a narrower time frame. When the moment finally arrives, there is no release valve, only pressure. Inside Russia's elite, this dynamic is already visible, not through open contestation, but through positioning. Influence is measured less by formal title than by proximity. Networks overlap without clarity, responsibilities blur, authority fragments quietly. In such environments, actors optimize for survival rather than performance. Risk aversion becomes rational. Initiative becomes dangerous. The system slows not because it lacks resources, but because it lacks assurance. This has consequences far beyond palace politics. Policy becomes conservative in the worst sense of the word, not cautious, but preservative. Decisions are evaluated not on outcomes, but on whether they disrupt existing balances. Structural problems are deferred. Temporary fixes become permanent fixtures. The future is treated as a threat vector rather than a planning horizon. This is how stagnation hardens into doctrine. The war in Ukraine intensifies this succession anxiety rather than postponing it. Wartime centralization increases dependence on the leader while simultaneously increasing the costs of failure. Victory would consolidate authority. Prolongation erodes it. Defeat is unthinkable. That creates a strategic trap. Escalation becomes easier than resolution, because resolution requires admitting limits. Speculation, clearly labeled, some analysts argue that this dynamic explains Russia's oscillation between maximalist rhetoric and tactical restraint. The regime must appear resolute without risking irreversible loss. It must project dominance without triggering consequences. It cannot manage. That balancing act grows harder over time, not easier. Meanwhile, the population adapts in ways that are politically invisible, but socially consequential. Emigration removes pressure rather than expressing it. Cynicism replaces protest. Private life becomes the refuge from public expectation. This does not destabilize the state immediately. It hollows it out. A society that disengages does not revolt, it withholds investment, trust, and imagination. Authoritarian systems can survive disengagement for long periods. What they cannot survive indefinitely is elite uncertainty layered on top of social withdrawal, layered on top of strategic overextension. Each layer alone is manageable. Together, they interact. And this is the most dangerous moment for such systems. Not when opposition is strong, but when accountability is absent. Without correction, errors compound. Without debate, assumptions calcify. Without legitimacy, power relies increasingly on enforcement. Enforcement, in turn, requires resources, loyalty, and credibility, all of which are finite. From the outside, it may be tempting to frame Russia's future as a binary, stability, or collapse. That framing misses the more likely and more consequential outcome: a prolonged period of constrained power, reactive policy, and heightened risk-taking. A state that cannot renew itself does not withdraw from the world. It lashes out unpredictably within it. This is where the democracy versus authoritarianism lens becomes unavoidable. Democratic systems absorb leadership change as a feature. Authoritarian systems experience it as a shock. One adapts through procedure, the other improvises through power struggles. One treats uncertainty as manageable, the other treats it as intolerable. Over time, that difference shapes global stability. The final escalation in this narrative is not about Vladimir Putin as an individual. It is about what happens when a system built to suppress questions can no longer avoid the most fundamental one. Not who opposes us, not who threatens us, but who comes after. That question cannot be answered with propaganda. It cannot be postponed with force. And it cannot be managed indefinitely through silence. History shows that when authoritarian systems reach this stage, their most consequential decisions are made not in confidence, but in fear. And fear, when it guides power, rarely produces restraint.